Welcome to a little segment I call ProFlo, where we digest professional workflows used in big network broadcasts, regional sports, the big 53-foot trucks, and see if we can cut them down the scale to work in, say, a smaller format such as vMix. And today's subject is replay zoom. If you've watched professional sports, you've seen a replay zoom, or even collegiate sports for that matter. Let's take football. A play happens, there's some discussion, was the foot inbounds, out of bounds on the catch, go into the replay, the broadcast zooms in the replay, and you can see there's blades of green between the foot and the white line. They are in bounds, it is a catch. Everybody's happy, well, except for the away team. That is done in a very interesting way, because most people probably think that is done in the replay system itself. And some replay systems can do that. But actually, the workflow for that in the broadcast trucks that I work in the control rooms for collegiate sports, it's all done in the switcher. And the switcher is well positioned to do this due to digital video effects. A Grass Valley, a Ross, a TriCaster can easily do this. So I was thinking, can vMix do this? Yes, it can. So let's first talk a little bit about the workflow in the truck, really briefly. So the producer is king. The producer is king of content, and replay falls under content. So the producer is deciding whether to go to replay, what angles to go to the replay, and then ultimately if the replay deserves a zoom in to enhance telling the story and thus the content. Obviously, there's a lot of teamwork involved in that. And it has to happen really fast, which is why the TD sitting there basically doing nothing during a replay is the perfect person, and the switcher is the perfect tool to do the zoom because they have time. But in a vMix world or a small scale world, you might have a one-person operation, or you might have just a couple people. So you have to condense that workflow down. And so a lot of times people use vMix as an all-in-one system, right? They're running the replays in it, and they're cutting in it, they're doing graphics in it, and there's one person operating it. Well, I've developed a workflow for a replay zoom that lets you do that in a one-person operation, but also lets you do it on a separate, say, vMix system bringing in replay inputs. So let's dive in how we make this. All right, we're gonna dive right into the vMix desktop and see how we do this. We got a game going here, a basketball game. This is game I directed for Pitt Studios for the ACC network, so I'm just using clips. So kind of have a traditional setup. We have a game cam, two cams under the net, 3 and 4, replay A and B. As you can see, I'm just using clips in a loop. Clip, camera 1 is a clip, replay A and B in a clip, and then 3 and 4 virtual inputs just for the effect. This does work with vMix Instant Replay. The only reason I'm not showing it with that is I need to use the multi-quarter to record this, so that's in there. So moving on down from the standard inputs you would see like on a broadcast in vMix is the grid preview, a zoom, which is black, and then the replay zoom grid. The zoom guide, we'll talk about inputs 10, 11, 12. Don't worry about, that's just cameras I'm using to record this. So, as you can see, we have a grid preview, and this is something you're going to have to make, and let's see what that kind of does here. I'm going to actually kind of go into a replay here, so we'll go into A, and then I'm just going to pause it. So as you can see, it brings up the grid overlaid over top of the replay, so then you can say what sector do I want to come out to, and then do your effect out to that sector to zoom in. So the grid is really just a graphic I made in Google Draw for all intents and purposes. You could probably do it in Photoshop or GIMP or something like that. The 9 box is the correct, breakout, because that preserves the 16:9 aspect ratio. So it's just lines and numbers over top of an alpha channel. That's all it is in a PNG format. Going back to this Zoom Guide 8 here, I'll put that online. So that, if you do the math, I have this in here because I created that to then create the grid, so I knew how to position the lines. It works out down to 640 by 360 pixels out of a 1920 by 1080. So, but you don't need that in vMix. I'm just showing you it here. So we'll put the preview back up. So we've wiped into a replay. As you saw, I used the fancy cube wipe. Obviously, if you're doing sports production, you should probably have a nice branded stinger. But just for demonstration purposes, we're going to use the cube wipe. I have my Stream Deck here, which is going to, control everything, and I have mapped out with shortcuts and triggers. That's what we're going to get into now on how to build this, is shortcuts and triggers. Now, some of you vMix experts might be screaming, why are you using shortcuts and triggers and not scripting? Well, scripting to me is too complex. I'm an old video guy who now lives and works in a computer and IT world because video transitioned to there from the days when I started back in college calibrating tube cameras. So I'm not very good with syntax and creating scripts and basically computer programming. And as a traditional, switcher user with Rosses and TriCasters, you don't do that there. So I'm not used to it. I don't like it. It's kind of a downfall, I think, of vMix. But I was like, how can we use this with shortcuts and triggers for the everyday vMix user? And that's what I've done. Now, if you don't know shortcuts and triggers, you probably might as well just stop here and then go watch some videos and information on how to do that and then come back out. So moving along, a lot of shortcuts, a lot of triggers to make this happen. Let's exit out of this. So we'll go back out to camera 1 here. And so, I'm going to reset like we're cutting cameras here. And so normally you go into a replay. Let's go into B here and then pause it. As you can see, when I went into B, it did the cube wipe. It put B on program, but then it put the grid preview on preview. So I've forced vMix to do that anytime I go to a replay, either A or B, so that we can have that grid preview, kind of full size, or at least bigger than the thumbnail, so that you have a better idea of what sector you want to zoom in on for your replay zoom effect. So how did we do this? Well, it was pretty easy. It was just a trigger. I'll go into replay B here since it's on, and I'll go into triggers. It's a simple trigger on transition in, put on preview input on preview, grid 6, the grid preview input 6, and a 500 millisecond delay. The delay is important because we're doing that wipe. And if we didn't have that delay before vMix put it onto preview, we would catch it and it would end up just going on to program. So we must put that delay in. And then if I go over to A, you see we have the same thing on A. So it's just a simple trigger that anytime either replay A or B or online on program, it's going to put input 6 into preview, and so that we're ready to go for that. So now we move on, right? That was the simple part. Now we got to look at, the zoom input in making the zoom. But let's first dive into what is actually the grid preview. Let's look at input 6. What is it? It's just a color. That's kind of crazy, right? But let's go into layers. I'm utilizing layers. Layer 1 and layer 2. Layer 1 is right now replay B, which we'll get into, and then layer 2 is the zoom grid that we made and brought in. I love layers. That's one of the great features of vMix in general, because every input has 10 layers attached to it. I think of it as a traditional switcher as an ME bank, like a mix effects bus, right? You can do a lot of things. So I use layers a lot. And so what I'm doing is, because if you realize, maybe you realized it, I have a replay A and I have a replay B, but I only have one grid preview. And depending on if I'm in A active or B active on program, what gets put into the grid preview on layer 1 is either A and B. I'm swapping it out, right? So I could have two grid previews, right? I could have one for A and I could have one for B, and then that triggers and go up. But then we're adding more, thumbnails, more inputs, more system resources. So we're just going to use one grid preview. And depending on if A or B are on program, it's going to swap out what is in layer 1 here. Okay, so right now it's replay B. And we do that with shortcuts. So let's go into shortcuts. So we have the top two shortcuts are traditional wipes, right? A and B, wiping in. So let's just take a look at them briefly. So it's just, press a button on the Stream Deck. It's a cube wipe, 250 millisecond delays. That's why I delayed stuff 500 milliseconds, because then that wipe is completely over with. You're wiping to input 4, replay A, and that's it. That's a standard shortcut. And the same thing with B, except it's wiping to B. Now you see a lot of red here. Now another benefit of vMix is you can assign multiple shortcuts to the same key, like the same button press on the Stream Deck. And that's crucial in doing this, and that's why it shows up red, because it's indicating that two shortcuts are assigned to the same button. Now, that's a downfall in vMix, and again, people are going to say, well, that's what scripting's for, which is great, but again, in traditional switchers, when you're creating, a macro or emem, and this is very generalized because each switcher, depending on a ROS, a TriCaster, or a Grass Valley, have different ways of doing it. But you can record it, which means you can record your button presses, so you can start the macro or emem to record, you press your buttons on the panel or what you want to have happen, and it records that, and then you can go in, adjust the timing, add in attributes and different things. It kind of creates basically a mini timeline. It's very intuitive, it's very powerful, and you can do a lot of stuff with that. vMix doesn't have that, unfortunately, and I wish that is something that they would do. So we're going to kind of be a little more complex, because we could do this a little more simpler if we had some sort of macro recording and could assign multiple events under one, shortcut. But now we're having to create multiple shortcuts. Follow? Yeah. All right, so replay wipe A is tied to grid A, and replay wipe B is tied to grid B. So if we go into grid A here, what you see is on the button press, it's going to set layer on input 6 grid preview 1 4, and the 1 meaning layer 1 and the 4 meaning input 4 replay A. If I X out of this and I go to B and I go into it, set layer, input 6, layer 1, input 5, that's replay B. So what those are doing is, depending if A or B is pushed, it is telling vMix on input 6 on layer 1 to either put replay A or replay B, so that when we have replay B online, it has the correct replay in layer 1 on the grid preview for us to proceed. So here we're all set up, it's frozen, we're ready to do our zoom, right? So we would pick a sector. So let's just pick 5. So I'm going to hit 5 here on the Stream Deck. We're going to zoom in. So you saw it just zoomed right in, and a couple things are happening here, right? The zoom input 7 is now online. Replay B is on preview. On input 6, the grid preview, the grid isn't there anymore, and obviously we have picture on input 7, okay? So that's important, and this is going to get a little kind of crazy, so follow along here. But let's first start with input 7 and take a look. What is input 7? So input 7, again, I'm using a lot of layers, because if we go in the general, it's just a color. So I'm using the layers to, again, manipulate this. And you see I'm utilizing 9 layers, all of them input 6 grid preview. And you're probably like, well, that's strange. But they're all different. As you see, layer 5 is active, right? And as you see, was sector 5. But if I turn it off and I say turn on layer 1, it's sector 1. And then 2 is sector 2, and so on and so on and so on. I'm going to put 5 back up. So I'm using the layers to zoom in X and Y move the picture from grid preview input 6 into the sector that I need. So if we go into edit, and this is again the beauty of vMix and the layers, we have basically a positioner, right? So zoomed in to 2.994, write that down because that's how the math works out. And then we have X and Y. Obviously 5, there is no X and Y because it's the center sector. So it's, stationary. But let's just look at sector 2. You can see the X and Y coordinates. We go to sector 8. There's the X and Y coordinates for sector 8. So on and so on and so on. So what's happening is on the Stream Deck, when we press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 9, whichever one we pick and press, it's going to turn on that layer on input 7, the corresponding layer to get the zoom sector. One thing you notice, as we said, is the grid preview is gone. So if we go into grid preview, we see it's turned off, and it has to be turned off because if I turn it on here, look what happens on program. You see a 5 and you see the box outline. We can't have that. So that has to get turned off when we actually put the zoom sector online on program. And we do that in zoom on input 7, and we do that on the triggers. So let's just look at the first 2 triggers right now. On transition 1, on transition in, we're going to turn layer off, input 6, grid preview, no delay needed for this one, and value 2. Value 2 meaning layer 2. So what it's doing is it's turning off layer 2 that has the grid on input 6. So whenever the zoom input goes online on program, it's going to turn off the grid so it's not there. Now we're going to need to reset it, right? We need everything to be back to 0. So that's what the next one does, is it on transition out, the layer goes back on input 6, and we're delaying it 500. We need to delay it there, again, because of the effect, and we're turning layer 2 back on. So let's see this, okay? So look in here. I'm going to clear it and then pause, and you see we went right back to where we were before we did the zoom. Replay B is online, the grid preview is back on preview, and the grid's back up. So we're back to square one, and we're ready to do it again. Okay, so now we got to dive deeper into how the zoom's happening. So I'm going to reset here so that we can come back out to a replay and take a look at this. So let's go to B this time. We'll go into B. All right, we're going to wait for it to re-loop here, and then I'm going to pause it. All right, so here we are now. So let's go into 5 again. So we're going to zoom into 5. How are we doing that zoom? Well, if you know, you know. If you don't, you really should, because it's so powerful. It's the merge transition. I love the merge transition. In a traditional switcher, you would have to go into a mix effects bus for this portion. You would have to create a timeline with a digital video effect. You would have to teach it, this is point A, this is point B, this is how fast I want to go to it, and all of that. And there's a lot of power in that because you can do a lot of things in that. But in vMix, the beauty is merge does it easily for you. What merge does is whatever on program, and whatever you're going to either go from preview to program or just like using a shortcut put on to program, it's going to merge the two. Now, if it's not the same picture, it's just going to basically do a dissolve. But if it's like, say, two people in a double box, you're going to go to the one person full, it's going to do that effect for you. It's going to do the A to B. It's going to do all that math. And so that's what I'm using. I'm going from the full A of the replay to the sector B and letting merge do that for me. That's done in shortcuts. So let's go into shortcuts. And so we have basically two sets of shortcuts tied to this. The first is the wipe, and then the next is the zoom. Again, they're tied together. Wipe 1 is tied to zoom 1, so that when you press the 1 button on the Stream Deck here for sector 1, they're both going to fire at the same time. So the wipe is real simple. It's just like a replay wipe. On the button push, you're going to do the merge effect, 300 milliseconds delay, go to input 7 zoom, and that's it. And that's just duplicated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's the same thing, just the different buttons. Now, the zoom needs to turn on the correct layer, right? Because remember, we're using layers on input 7, the 1 through 9 for each sector to turn on. So then the tide shortcut, the zoom shortcut, turns on and off those layers. So let's go into it. So on the button push, the function is layer on input 7 zoom in value 1, meaning turn on layer 1. Now if I get out of this and I go to 5, zoom 5, it's the same thing except it's value 5, turn on layer 5, right? So that's all we're doing. We're doing a simple merge effect, and we're turning on and off layers to get the correct sector. Next, we want to clear this, right? And you saw it happen already, but we have a clear button, and there is a shortcut for that down here, and it's a simple, again, wipe shortcut. Press the button, it's going to do the merge effect, 300 milliseconds, but this time it's going to put what's in preview, which should always be either replay A or replay B, depending on what you're on. It's just going to merge it back over, and you're going to get back to the full screen. So let's see that happen. So I will hit clear, and then I'll pause it, and we're back to normal here. We're back to ready to then, wipe out to game action, which I'll do now, wipe out to game action. And so that's how it's done. We're just using shortcuts and triggers to manipulate a bunch of layers and inputs to get our desired effect and to get our zoom sectors. So now let's look at it, how we would in action to see it in its full, glory sort of thing. So here we are, we're in action. We're going to go to replay A. We're going to pause it. All right, let's look at sector 8. We'll zoom into 8. All right, let's clear that and then effect back out to game action. We're cutting around. Now let's go into B. We'll pause B. Let's look at sector 5. Zoom in the 5. We see 5. We clear it, and then we effect back out. Now, if you wanted to effect back out while you're zoomed in, you can do that in this too. So let's look at that. We'll go into A here. We'll pause it. For fun, let's look at sector 8 to look at their feet. There's sector 8, and let's go back out to camera 1. We're back out to camera 1, and as you can see, everything reset back. And there you go. We came back out to game action from a zoomed in sector. So you don't have to go back full screen. You can be in a zoomed in sector and then wipe back out to your live action. If you're wondering if you can go from sector to sector and kind of bounce around, that's not designed for this, because remember, we're using the layering, and the layering has priority. Layer 9 is over top of everything else. So if you go into sector 5, but then want to go back and look at sector 1, nothing's going to happen. If you go from 5 to 8, that's going to work. So generally, you're not going to want to go from sector for sector, and that's something that the broadcast people don't do. They zoom in and they either wipe out of it or they zoom back out. Again, if you have this into vMix Instant Replay, you can jog it. Use a jog, it'll be paused, and you can jog it back and forth. Pretty easy, isn't it? I won't lie, it was a little difficult. Like most things, I think in the shower and come up with ideas. I was doing that one day. How can I do that in vMix? And I went, I'll just do this and that and that and this and this. It'll be so simple. I came down, started to build it, just ran into roadblock after roadblock, would have to tear everything down, go in a different direction and rebuild it. So it was a little bit tricky. It took me some time to come down with a workflow that makes this work very easily. Again, 1,001 ways to do stuff. You might think of something better, or you're just still sitting there fuming that I'm not using scripting. But again, I wanted to use shortcuts and triggers to see if I could do it, and also to make it simple for other people to do it, learn, and expand on it. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you got something out of it, and go out there and make your small production look like the big boys.